In this How-To-Svelte, we're going to make an audio player. As you can see, it's got some basic controls. It's got a heading for which track is playing, as well as a progress bar. And in addition to that, it's got a playlist where we can switch tracks. In addition to that, it's got an arrow that allows us to jump forward a certain amount of time, as well as a rewind arrow that will allow us to decrement the same amount. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll go to Svelte REPL and start with a blank one. And the first thing we'll bring in is we'll start off with a main tag and a section tag, which will house the player. We'll bring in some CSS. And so we've got a blank container. Let's go ahead and start by adding the controls, which are these three. That's going to be the play and the pause, the forward and the rewind. And I'll go ahead and bring in some CSS. Now we can't see anything yet, so what I'm going to do is go out and get some SVG files of a play button, a pause, a back, and a forward, and I'll bring those in. So I've made an object called icons with some keys, play, pause, rewind, forward, so I'll just use these as the icons. Okay, good. So we've got our buttons in. So now, of course, they don't work yet. So let's go ahead and bring in some audio. And what I'm going to do is add another file called audioData.js. Made an array called audioData, and it's got 3 files in it. And each file's got 2 properties, a name and a URL. So let's go ahead and export this. And we'll import it into app. And since this is an array, we'll keep track of the index in terms of what file we're playing. So if we want to play the first file, that'll be index 0. So let's go ahead and create a variable here, and we'll call it track index. We'll set it to 0 for now. And then let's instantiate an instance of the audio object. We'll call this audio file. And then this requires the URL to the audio file. And so that'll be from audioData. And the index will be track index. So right now it's set to 0, but whatever we set it to later. And then to get the URL, we made a key called URL. So it's going to be .url. So now let's go down and wire up these buttons. So let's start with the first one. This will be the play button. We'll add an on click. We'll just call this play audio. And let's create that function. And that will basically take audio file, and we'll use the play method. Now, if you wonder what kind of methods are available to the audio object, you can come over to W3 Schools or Mozilla Developer Network and take a look at the audio object. You can see there's a number of properties as well as methods. And if we look at the methods, we see there's a play method as well as a pause method. And we'll use both of those. So this is simple. We just want to click this button, call the play audio function, which will then call the play method on this audio object, which will play this file. Let's try that.
Pariyati Audiobooks presents Dana, The Practice of Giving. Selected essays edited by Bhikkhu Bodhi, narrated by Judy Swift.
Now we have no way to stop this, so I'm just going to refresh the page. But at least we got it to play. Now we saw from the audio object that there was a pause method as well. So that means that this button can act as both a play and a pause controller. So let's rename this function. We'll call it play pause audio. So what we can say is if audio file dot, and there is a property on the audio object called paused, sets or returns whether the audio is paused, and that's what we want to check. So let's say if audio file dot paused, then go ahead and then next time we click the arrow, or next time we click this icon, go ahead and play the file. Else we'll do audio file pause, which is a method. So we've got paused, which is the property, which will return true or false, and then we got the method called pause. Okay, so let's try this out now.
Pariyati Audiobooks presents Dana,
And we can pause it. I'll press it again.
The Practice of Giving.
And we'll pause
Selected S.
Good, so that's working. So the next thing we want to do is when we're in a paused mode, we want to switch this icon. And I have imported an icon called pause, so let's bring that in. And we'll come down to it's this button that's acting as the play. And within the source attribute, we'll do a little bit of logic. Is playing is true, then do icons.pause, else do icons.play. Now it's saying is playing is not defined, so we got to go ahead and make that Boolean. And we'll set it to false. And when the audio is playing, then we want to set is playing to true. And if it's paused, we want to set it to false. So now, depending on those conditions, it will either show the pause icon or the play icon. And that's here. So let's give that a shot now.
Pariyati Audiobooks presents Dana, the Practice.
Good, so that's working. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the on-click to the button itself rather than the image. That was a mistake, so let's put it up here instead. And so we have the Boolean here to show whether it's play or pause, but then the on-click should be on the button. And so on the rewind, we'll also put an on-click. And we'll call a function called rewind. Let's go ahead and make that real quick. We'll call it rewind audio. And in order to make the audio go back or go forward, we're going to look at a property called current time, which sets or returns the current playback position. So whatever the audio file dot current time is, we'll go ahead and minus from that, let's say 10. So let's just try that.
Pariyati Audiobooks presents Dana, the Practice of Giving. Selected.
Good. So right now it almost sounds like it's rewinding all the way to the beginning, but eventually when we're in the middle of the file, it'll just jump back 10 seconds. And so that's the same idea with the forward button too. We're just going to put an on click. But we'll plus 10 seconds. So now let's try that.
Narrated by Judy as one of the and
so that's jumping forward 10 seconds, and then let's go back 10 seconds.
Seed of spiritual developments of special self-trans, one of the most basic Bhikkhu Bodhi.
Good. So we got that working. Okay, so that's pretty much the three controls we're going to use, and everything's working. So now let's break this off into a component, which is good practice, and we'll call this controls.svelte. Then we'll come grab all the HTML and CSS from app and move it over to controls. Okay, now when we look at the controls HTML, there is one prop that we're going to need to pass, which is this Boolean isPlain. So let's go ahead and export isPlain, and then we'll handle these on clicks soon enough. And let's go ahead and import controls into app. And so we'll go ahead and get rid of the CSS and replace it with controls. And we'll get rid of the button CSS down here. And so it's yelling at us now because we haven't included some of the on clicks, as well as we haven't included the isPlain prop. So let's go ahead and bring that in first. And it's also saying the icons are not defined. So I'll come up here and grab the icons object and move that over to controls. Okay, now the only three things it's worrying us about are these on-click events. Now the problem is that all three of these buttons are using on-click events. So if we come back over here to the component, if we write on-click, we don't really know how to specify which button is being clicked. And so the way we're going to do it is we're going to create a custom event. And so we'll create EventDispatcher and import that from Svelte. And then we'll create a variable called dispatch. And we'll assign that to the createEventDispatcher function. So now the way we do this is we use the dispatch function. So we'll remove this rewind audio event handler. Instead, we'll put an anonymous function, which we'll call dispatch. And one of the arguments we'll provide is the name, the new custom name of the event listener. So I'll call this rewind. So now if I come over to the app, and on the controls component, instead of putting on click, I'll put on rewind, and I'll call the rewind audio function. So now let's go ahead and do the same thing for the play pause audio. Again, we'll use the dispatch function here. Remove that event handler. Use an anonymous function, which we'll call dispatch. And then we'll name the custom event listener, which I'll just call play pause. And so here on controls, we'll make another listener on play pause, which we'll call the function play pause audio. Okay, and we'll do the last one for the forward arrow. Then back over to the app component, and we'll look at the controls component here and add an on forward, which we'll call the event handler forward audio. Good, so now all of our error messages are gone. Everything looks okay. Let's go ahead and test it out.
How-To-Swift. Introduction. As one of the most basic we read time and again of spirit, a place capacity for self.
Good. Sounds like everything's working. Now, if we go back over to the audio player again, we've got this track heading, which will show the name of the track. And if we look at our audioData object, we can see we've got the URL, which we're using, but let's go ahead and use the name property as well. So just under the section tags, we'll put the track heading. And we'll use the track index and then the name property. Good, so we got it to show up here. Let me just add a little bit of CSS. Okay, good. So that's centered. So let's go ahead and break this out into a component as well. We'll call it track heading. And I'll go ahead and move over the HTML and CSS. Now, if we look at the HTML here inside the component, we're not going to be able to hard code this. We could import the audio data, but I'm going to keep all the audio data centralized in just the app. So let's replace this with a variable. And then what we want to do is we want to import track heading. And so we'll create another variable here that we'll call it track title. And that'll be equivalent to this path here, but we'll switch URL to the name property. And so this track title matches this track title, which we're exporting. So down in track heading, we could put some Svelte syntax and put track title inside there. So I just had to fix that. Okay, good. So the track heading's showing up. And the last thing we're going to do is, in this video, is we're going to add the volume slider here. And we'll put that right below the controls here. Okay, so we've got the slider in here. It's got a min value of 0 going all the way up to 100. And we'll step by 1. Every input's got a value, so we want to bind this value of this input to a property that we'll create up here. We'll set it to 50. So this is for the volume slider. Because our min is at 0 and our max is at 100, we're setting it at 50. And we'll also show that number here on the right side, which is what this label's for. Good, so it shows up. Now this isn't going to work with the volume yet, so what we have to do is add an onInput event listener, and that'll listen for any value changes in this slider. So as we're dragging it up and down, it'll change value, and this is listening for that. And when it hears it, we're going to call a function called adjust volume. So let's come up here and make that. And if we go back to our W3 schools, you'll notice that the object audio properties does have a volume property, sets or returns the audio volume. And we're going to assign that to whatever vol is here, divided by 100. And we have to divide by 100 because this volume property only deals with numbers between 0 to 1. So let's test that out.
Pariyati audiobooks.
So no volume.
The Practice of Giving. Selected essays edited by Bhikkhu Bodhi, narrated by Judy.
So that's all hooked up. Now let's go ahead and break this into a component, and we'll call this volume slider. I'll go ahead and move over the HTML and CSS. Okay, so again, looking at the volume slider component, we're including props that haven't been established between the app and this component. So we're going to have to go ahead and export this. And then on input, again, we don't want to call the event handler here, but what we'll do is we'll just forward the event listener on up. So let's go ahead and import volume slider. And you can see this is undefined here. That's this volume prop that we need to pass. And because we're using the same name as what we made in app, we can go ahead and just do some Svelte curly braces. So good, now the value shows up. But now it's not going to work quite yet, and that's because we haven't brought in our onInput. So on input, we'll go ahead and call the adjustVolume event handler that we created. Now, the one interesting thing here is it looks like everything's set. We actually have the value coming through, and we're calling the event handler. It should work. But the problem is that when we go back to volume slaughter, we can see we were binding this value to volume. And so this isn't going to work quite yet because we have to still make reference to this bind directive inside app. And so what we'll do is we'll do this instead. Let's remove the curly braces. We'll do bind, vol. Now we'll actually adjust the volume as needed.
Pariyati and Dana, the practice of giving.
And so there we go. There is a basic audio player with pause, play, forward, and rewind controls, as well as a volume slider. And what we'll do in part 2 is we'll add this progress bar. If you haven't seen my video on how to svelte progress bar, check that out first, and that'll give you a heads up on how we're doing it. And then it'll be easier to do it as we connect it to the audio. You can see we'll also add the duration of the audio file as well as some numbers to count up. And then we'll add this playlist to add multiple files.